arrived just before the snow. No one saw him come. His name was printed on a lease application filed 3 months prior, but no one in the office remembered signing it. Still, the key worked. Cabin 7 had been empty for nearly 2 decades, untouched except for seasonal maintenance and the occasional lost hiker who wandered through the resort's off-season roads. It sat at the very end of the ridge, past 6 other cabins long since condemned. There were no trails leading to it, not officially. That first night, he lit no fire. No lights showed through the windows. But in the morning, a plume of wood smoke drifted straight up into the frozen sky. Snow began falling lightly, quietly. The tracks from the road to the cabin disappeared in it by mid-afternoon. He had no car. He had no visitors. The propane tank behind the cabin showed 0 usage. The woodpile, however, grew. From where? No one could say. The last delivery was recorded in 2003. After 3 days, the weather turned. Bitter wind coiled through the valley like something alive, snapping branches and slamming into the cabins below. Power lines danced. Something heavy moved through the snow one night, too slowly to be a bear, too confidently to be lost. The man never left the cabin, yet every morning footprints circled it. Only one set, barefoot, pressed deep into the crust. A new path formed down the slope behind the structure, winding between the trees, further and further out each day, always returning. The 7th morning, something was standing in the clearing, just beyond the edge of visibility. It was too distant to make out clearly, but the shape was wrong for a person. Narrower, upright, still. The snow on its shoulders never melted. That same day, the cabin door was left wide open. No tracks led to it. At dusk, the lights came on in the 6 condemned cabins, faint, like candles behind thick curtains. The power had been shut off for years. No fresh snow landed on their roofs. The trees around them had stopped swaying. On the 10th night, the generator at the main lodge died. No storm, no mechanical issue, just stopped. The lodge manager drove up to check on cabin 7, but the road ended 100 yards short, swallowed by a sudden wall of fog. Thick, pale grey, smelling faintly of rust and burning hair. Cabin 7 was gone. In its place was an open field of untouched snow, perfectly smooth except for one line. Narrow, clean, stretching across the clearing and up into the woods behind it. A single mark, as if something had been dragged, something heavy but obedient. The treetops bent inward along the line's path, curling toward it like they were being pulled. The snow around the field never melted. Spring came, but the ridge stayed cold. Wildlife avoided it. Birds stopped flying over. The cabins below were bulldozed without ceremony. But every now and then, hikers reported a flicker of firelight up on the slope, just past where cabin 7 used to be. A single chimney's smoke trail rising from a place the map no longer showed. Sometimes they found footprints circling their camp in the morning, barefoot, human, but always just one set, and always walking in circles. No fences surrounded the orchard. The trees stood in ordered rows, unnaturally precise, their trunks thin and silvery as if frost had never left them. No insects buzzed there, no birds perched in the branches. The ground beneath them remained dry even after rain. The apples were perfect. Uniform, polished red, with skins that never bruised. Each one hung too heavy on its stem, barely swaying even in wind. They didn't drop on their own. They waited. The townspeople avoided the place. They didn't talk about it. There was nothing to say. The orchard had been there longer than the gas station, longer than the school, longer than the road that curved just slightly to avoid it. Kids were told to leave it alone. They did, mostly. Each autumn, the trees grew heavy with fruit until the weight bent the branches low. Still no one came. No baskets, no trucks, no signs. The apples dropped only after the first frost and lay in neat rings beneath the trees, untouched. They never shriveled. They just softened, then sank into the soil. When the newcomers came, they asked questions. They said the apples looked beautiful, organic, untouched by pesticides. A couple picked some, despite the sideways glances from the grocery clerk and the silence of the old man at the hardware store. They bit into them at picnics, offered slices to their children, canned them in jars, stacked like trophies on kitchen shelves. The changes began quietly. One woman began waking at 3:07 a.m. every morning, standing barefoot in her living room, staring at a spot in the wall with no visible mark. She stopped speaking during the day. A week later, her husband stood in the exact same place, eyes wide, murmuring syllables no one could translate. Their dog refused to enter the room. Another family repainted their entire house one night, coats of paint layered over perfectly fine walls, black, then pale green, then finally back to white. But the brush strokes never dried evenly. Shapes began to form in the streaks. Names scratched into baseboards. The husband dug a hole in the backyard that never seemed deep enough, even after hitting something solid. Children stopped making eye contact. The following harvest, the apples were larger, more red than red should be. When sunlight hit them, their skins reflected too much, almost metallic. There were fewer trees now, though no one had cut any down. They had simply shifted closer together, narrowing the rows. The grocery store carried more canned goods than fresh that year. The school trimmed its staff due to funding. Some houses had lights on timers, but no movement behind the curtains. Cars stayed parked too long without accumulating dust. The mail didn't always get picked up. A man driving through town late one night passed the orchard and glanced over. Dozens of shapes stood silently between the trees, upright, unmoving, facing inward, not picking, just watching. When he passed the same spot in the morning, there was nothing but the trees. The apples had already dropped, and this time, they didn't rot. They stayed whole through winter, through spring. By summer, the ground under the trees had hardened. No grass, no weeds, just dry soil and the glint of buried red. The road curved wider the next year, bowing out to avoid the orchard altogether. Eventually, no one asked about the apples. Eventually, there was no one left to. Some stories don't end, they wait. Like, share, and subscribe to hear what comes next.